Welcome to The Story Behind the Story, a behind-the-scenes exploration of the human experience in all aspects of life, love, and leadership. Today, we're going to explore with Mika Cross transformational and innovative global workspaces. Mika is a widely acclaimed workplace expert, speaker, strategist, and innovator, specializing in interdisciplinary expertise among the areas of innovative global workplace initiatives, remote and distributed work, cultural change, strategic communications, knowledge management, next generation workplace and future of work predictions and initiatives, performance and talent management, employee labor relations, diversity, inclusion, and employee engagement. Her career includes 20 plus years of public service with assignments throughout the United States intelligence community. And she is a veteran of the United States Army, having served as both an enlisted soldier and commissioned officer. I'm your host, Angie Bailey.
Hi, I'm your co-host, Lynette Sprowls.
I'm also your co-host, Dominic.
To begin with, one of the things I would love to know, and I tell you it's a question I get asked all the time. So tell me, how did you really get into this line of business? Because my guess is when you were in kindergarten, this is not what you wrote down as what you were going to end up doing when you grew up.
And what a mouthful that is, Angie. So I certainly did not think I would get into the area of sort of workplace, workforce, everything when I was in kindergarten. In fact, I grew up in rural Maine. In one of those areas where I can actually say I walked a mile uphill in sub-zero weather, both directions to get to school. Even at my age, I was able to do that. And I never really would have imagined, sort of where I ended up. And I'd like to think it was a little based on destiny and the universe pointing me in the right direction, but also has a large part to do with the fact that I did decide to serve this country at a very young age. So I enlisted from my hometown in Bangor, Maine. For any of you fans of Stephen King, that is our claim to fame. And so I started my career in uniform, as you mentioned, as an enlisted soldier. I was always sort of assigned to where the boys were, even though I was in TRADOC initially. I worked at Fort Knox, Kentucky with a cavalry unit serving the International Military Student Office. And from there, I was invited to apply for a scholarship to become an officer. Which I did throw my hat in the ring for and ended up getting. Completed my degree, got my commission as a lieutenant in the year 2000, and then got sent over to work with the 3rd Infantry Division in Fort Stewart, Georgia, supporting the Rock of the Marne, right? Which is like one of the Army's fastest, largest scale deployable units ever. Until 9/11 happened, where I was then sent to work with the United States intelligence community, a 3-letter IA agency. I was pregnant, finishing my master's degree. By the way, I failed to mention at the time I was an adjutant general chairborne ranger. So I was supporting rapidly deployable troops, but serving in sort of a personnel capacity. And it was during that experience that I really realized the importance and impact of supporting the whole person in terms of really leaning into supporting families and spouses and sort of the role of combat support. And so my passion started really laying into how policies, initiatives, and programs could serve to support the family unit and the whole person by focusing on what's most important to our troops, our leaders, and those who are putting their lives on the line each and every day from a perspective of making sure that the home front is okay so that they can focus on their job. And from there, I became a new mom, but also got divorced. And so lots of things that life throws at you, while also navigating a career in the Washington, D.C. area. And decided to transition when I pinned on captain. I decided to transition from serving in uniform to serving Uncle Sam in a civilian capacity, where, like you, I got an early start in human capital in the employee management relations kind of area. And very quickly realized that I was sort of more passionate around advocating for people than sort of good management practices, although I believe in that. Traipsed my way all across the government, advocating and learning best practices and policy support in work, life, and wellness and diversity and inclusion, but really bringing in that people-focused lens to transforming how people work, where they work, when they work, and how they can bring their best work regardless of location. So that's my thing and kind of where I started. I know that's also a big mouthful as well, but hopefully it helps paint the picture a little bit.
For folks that are out there, a chairborne ranger, that's so funny whenever I heard that. So can you explain that a little bit more? Because I have a feeling that Lynette and Dominic might even want to understand what that means a little bit more.
It's a little joke, a little colloquialism in the armed forces, because traditionally your ranger forward forces are airborne ranger in the Army and in the military. And so for personnel support, especially in uniform, we would joke and sort of chastise ourselves a little bit around the fact that we were chairborne rangers, meaning we support from a knowledge-based kind of work environment rather than on the front lines. Equally as important, combat support is important, but we weren't forward-facing in combat. So yeah, that's what I meant by that. Thank you.
As you were saying it, I was watching Lynette and I was like, oh, I don't know if Lynette.
Always has to clarify for me.
I know.
I was just thinking if I heard that correctly, chairborne. Okay, I can work with that.
This is kind of like, what was it whenever we interviewed Alex Trumbull and you and Alex, Dominic, were talking about
Oh, superheroes.
that guy, that T-shirt you both have.
Yeah.
Oh man, I wish you could remember. It was for a particular superhero?
Yeah, it was a superhero comic he was asking you if you knew about.
Some Japanese thing, I think, or something. He takes on all these people. And at the end, you always know that he's going to do one punch. That's what he was called.
Yeah, one punch man. Yeah.
He and Dominic were talking about this One Punch Man. And I was like, I have no idea what you guys are even talking about.
Every HR department needs a one punch man.
Ranger
Right?
cheerleader rangers, of course.
Mika, it's amazing, like just, hearing you explain everything you've done and everything Angie's done. I would just love to know, like, as you look through everything you've been through, every experience, what do you feel like was the most pivotal moment that shaped you, like, into who you are now?
I don't know if there's just one that I would point to necessarily, but I can point to an assignment that forevermore I would think to myself, boy, I hope that I can always say that was the hardest, most challenging thing I've ever done. And that was supporting the Iraq survey group after 9/11. So I had just had my first child and was coming back off of maternity leave. And the agency that I was working for received instructions to be the executive agent of this huge en masse deployment effort across the intelligence community to go search and find WMD at the time they thought was there. And it really required a level of effort. I don't even know if I could describe it, but let me just put it into perspective, Angie. I was a lieutenant still. And so I was a first lieutenant, probably serving in like a lieutenant colonel or above. That's very senior ranking kind of position. And also teetering with having to juggle the fact that I was a brand new mom, like 2 months my daughter was. And I remember I had originally been serving as an executive officer of the entire military personnel branch for this intelligence agency. And the full board colonel I worked for knew that we needed to stand up an entire rear component, work with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, work all across the intelligence community to source manpower and people and resources and personnel, and to also establish the mechanism, meaning the structure by which we would start sending people into this huge, large-scale effort for a deployment. And this was deploying civilians, contractors, getting international forces to come on board, and asking the services to give up what we call manpower, right? So like billets and people and resources. And I remember he pointed at me and said he wanted me to stand up the J-Run rear. So that's your personnel shop and output in the rear, sort of supporting this initiative. And this 05 naval commander raised his hand and said, no, Lieutenant Cross just had a baby. Let me take this assignment. And I was like, yeah, let him take the assignment. I really don't want to do this. And frankly, it scared me. But the colonel really wanted me to take the lead on it. And I will say it was the hardest, most challenging. I mean, I was probably working, you know this, Angie, from probably some of your missions and days in this kind of work as well, 14, 16 or more hour days. While also every day they would say like, oh, we really going to need you downrange in the sandbox as you start rolling out this initiative. But I learned so much. I stretched myself in a lot of different ways, a lot of tears some days when I would come home and pet my little infant baby on the hair, but I was thankful that I could at least see her, right? And I just can't even put into words how much I learned and grew from that long, arduous assignment. And then I decided to resign my commission and work in the civilian side. But I think that was really defining because I had to put everything I possibly had in terms of like energy and effort and learn as I went and work at echelons higher than I ever had worked before, or really should, to be honest. But they were short-staffed, so they needed people to serve in a different capacity. And then learning to like interface with these like general officers and 06s and above. Well, I was just this young 20-something-year-old, captain that I did get promoted before I left. And then just faced with the uncertainty of having to deploy. Like I said, it was almost every 3 days. They weren't sure if I was going to have to go or not, which is a, condition of employment when you serve Uncle Sam in that capacity. But the angst I felt in terms of having to ask like my troops to do something that I wasn't sure I wanted to do anymore once I became a mother was really tricky to contend with. So I was really thankful when I had the opportunity to transition my career in a different direction. But it was still a very hard choice because I was succeeding in that and had to make those difficult decisions.
Mika, you talked about, if I understand it correctly, you're more interested in, maybe your term is like self-management rather than like, the leadership management things. And what led you to that moment where you said, actually, I'm much more interested in how people are navigating their own lives and supporting themselves and being supported rather than say from like the management perspective?
I think it was early on in my career, when I got a sense for how people were experiencing work and also hearing the other side of the story in terms of how managers were experiencing people who were having trouble in their lives and that it was affecting their work as well, either from a performance or conduct issue. And so it's clearly important for organizations to hold people accountable and make sure that they're following the rules and that they're, abiding by the structures that we put in place. But at the same time, I could see the bigger picture of what was happening. And so, in investigations and when you're doing research and trying to make recommendations in terms of what actions need to be taken, the goal, at least in the government, in order to take a personnel performance action or conduct action, really the goal is to change that into a more successful pathway, right? Is like to change the behavior and rectify the issues rather than just get rid of them altogether. But a lot of times I would see managers who weren't sure and didn't understand that sort of component of it. The coaching piece, also the empathy piece around just considering all the factors while still holding accountable, to the standards that we have to when you're talking about performance and conduct. So it sort of opened the aperture for me to be really like experience workplace policy, human capital procedures, our programs, our training from a more user-centered, employee-centered focus versus then just, taking a management action or an agency-based action, which sometimes you have to do. I had to let people go and make recommendations on termination and really hard work like that. It took an emotional toll on me also because there's people behind it. But I remember the first action that I had to recommend when I was in that role. I was really young. I was in employee management relations. I think I was a GS-12 at the time. And we had to let someone in their 50s go who transitioned from another agency because she wasn't performing. And we did it so well that she actually sent a thank you note after, even though we had let her go. And it just touched my heart a little bit. And while it was a sad, unfortunate issue, we did it with empathy. And I think I felt like I, helped sort of bridge that gap between the management and the person. And I knew that was sorely needed, especially in the intelligence community at that time, where we were faced with critical shortages of diversity and women representation in our core critical occupations. A lot of times women would wait and not have children until later in their careers. And we were not advancing women at the time as rapidly, maybe as we should have or wanted to. And so I just saw the impact of sort of culture and the impact of how you can approach policies, initiatives, and programs from that human-centered, employee-centered kind of approach. And I loved it. And then when the 9/11 Commission started coming in with its recommendations, even though I was in HR, the whole intelligence enterprise was really focused on testing and doing things differently because it needed to foster a whole revolution of modernizing and transforming the workplace. And I was able to jump in and raise my hand and volunteer in that capacity as well. So from a transformational and culture change perspective, I was able to bring those perspectives in, and even the human capital side of the house, into how we were sort of transforming the whole way of work, but from a people perspective.
You use that word, at least I heard it twice, empathy. Is that the word that you use, or like the concept you try to spread? Because, management might be focused on time management, it might be focused on productivity, it might be focused on hitting certain metrics or like deadlines. But, this aspect of empathy, like, how did you communicate, and let people know that there was actually fruit going down this path of being more empathetic as opposed to just being more forceful to get people to meet what's in their performance plan?
I think you raise a really good point in terms of what we call things. And so there are a lot of buzzwords. I did say empathy, but what I really mean by that is good government. And you can take that any way you want. There's good government programs, there's good government policy, there's good government skills-based, competency development when you're thinking about investing in your workforce. But there's also an approach where good government also means, how are you teaching people to lead the people that do the work and the mission? And that's where I feel like I resonate, or where it resonates the most with me. When I say empathy, that's one of the skills I think that we need to invest more in, but it's certainly not the only one in terms of taking that approach of employee-based, human-centric, almost like user-centric focused approach at how we're supporting the workforce, because we're going to get better results that way. Productivity, we're going to get better performance. We're going to get more innovation, better creativity, and impact overall for the taxpayer when you're talking about the federal government, I believe.
I think as we go down this path, at least like what I've learned over the years, is your point about being human-centric, right? And so almost all of this is made up of humans, and in some cases 100% humans. And yet we seem to always put that to the side. And it's, the words that used to always drive me crazy is when we would say it was like human resources, or our people are our greatest asset, like as if they were a desk or a chair, right? And we could account for them, and then we slot them into billets and things like that. And so I know over the years, and this is where I think our paths kind of crossed, where we were thinking alike. It's like, yeah, but these humans are messy and they're complex, and they don't always do what we ask them to do. But usually there's a story behind why they're not doing what they need to do. And to your point, what goes on at home goes to work. What goes on at work goes home. And so it's like, it's always around like, how do we look at this from the whole person perspective? And so as you were talking, and I was thinking about you being a young mother and the things you were trying to do, how much do you think your own personal life, and Lynette and I have these conversations sometimes about coaching, right? Like how you not put your own lens or see an issue through your own lens. Whereas in coaching, that makes perfect sense, right? Because you don't want to do that. But like, I'm just wondering, like, how much of your own life or your own lens did you use to put into the programs and things that you tried to put forth?
Early in my career, I think 100%. I remember, having these opportunities where when I was in human resources and human capital, like those really technical kinds of positions, and learning and growing. I remember supervisors coming and saying, we need someone to volunteer to write these, they called them personnel operating procedures at the time, these POTS, or these updates to these policies. And I would rate me, I'll do it. Well, the reason why I wanted to do it is because I wanted to change the policies and the procedures, and not just for myself, but for myself too. Again, I was a young mom. So I had my hands in the FlexiPlace policy very early on. And this is in the intelligence community in a skip environment. And I remembered like the power of the pen in terms of I would volunteer for the assignment. I would understand the code, right, that governs the entire government. But then I would also bring in my expertise in communications. And so I would start to change words and language. Like instead of employees may not request more than 4 days of telework or FlexiPlace per week, I would change it and say managers may approve up to X number of days per pay period, so that people could actually clearly understand what's in their control and what's not in their control. And I was very deliberate around writing in plain language, but also writing it through the lens of what you can do versus what you can't. And often in human capital and human resources, especially when you're policy experts, you're putting in the legal guidance. It's very bureaucratic language. And sometimes it makes it really hard for people to understand what their resources are, what the policies are, and how to get around it. And my goal was like, how do we get to yes? They approved the policies. I started writing more of them. I got involved in updating a lot of different policies outside of even just human capital and the business lines. And I'm telling you that the fact that we also trained people very well in terms of how to apply those policies and how to open the door to even have two-way conversations. This was back in very early, 2000s. Part of it was I had a passion because I knew I wanted a change in the way that we were working. But I didn't want it just for me. I wanted it for others, because I would meet people in the nursing mothers rooms. And these were like Farsi speakers, Intel analysts, intelligence officers who had waited a long time to have their families and were waiting with bated breaths for things like the part-time employment policy or the update to the flexi place or job sharing. And even when the policies came out, they weren't able to participate in them because managers didn't understand how to apply it or how they could or not say yes.
I hear inside of there, like, so much passion for change, Mika. I just hear, like, through so much of your career, like, you're just that advocate for people, just to help them. What are you passionate about right now? Like, what's your major passion that you're really wanting to push some change on?
Still mindsets. I mean, if you look at the GAO reports and every testimony that's given to Congress around future of work. And I don't just mean flexibility and location. People think I'm only an advocate for flexibility and location. I'm not. I'm an advocate for good government policies that are people focused, that can really support, empower, and enable people to do their best work while holding them accountable for the work that they do. I believe in that. But really it's around mindset change. And I think also we really lack an investment in helping the people who are leading the people to be able to do it well. And so we still have a lot of work to do there. I mean, the lowest level and middle level of managers are really suffering. They're experiencing burnout and stress and workplace anxiety at the highest levels. And this is not just in government, but in private industry too. And so I'm very passionate around helping and supporting the people that are leading people so we can get greater outcomes. And also, of course, thinking about that human-centered approach to our work environments. If we're not keeping pulse on how people are experiencing work, which is such a huge part of our lives, as we all know, we're really missing the mark. And there are significant impacts to turnover and attrition and burnout. We're not going to be able to perform our mission. The bottom line will be affected if you're working in a private industry organization if we don't get this right.
I agree with you. That mindset piece is so huge. And it's the piece that's been skipped over for so long. So I love that so many people are shining a light on that and just saying it's a skill we've got to give people this skill set, because we weren't taught it in elementary school. We weren't taught it at those times when it was developmental. So how do we do it as adults?
And it does seem a shame. Like I did a presentation the other day on innovation and creativity and stuff. And I do fundamentally believe that we were born to be creative, right? We were born to be risk takers. I mean, that's how we learned to walk. That's how we learned to do so many of the things that we've learned to do on our own and stuff. And yet somewhere along the way, like, it all has been in some ways pulled out of folks. Not everybody, right? Some people still go ahead and push forward. But for the most part, I just feel like it's all been like pulled out of folks. And it's like, no, you got to follow the rules. No, you got to color within the lines. No, you can't take a risk. No, you can't fail. And so as a result, I think we've become a society of almost mediocrity, right? Instead of like really being innovative and creative and really kind of pushing forward. And so I'd love your thoughts along those lines as well, like especially like what are ways that you think that we can start to instill that back into our leaders? Because I think it was there at one time, many moons ago. And so how do we bring that back out for them?
Back to the point around semantics and what we call things as well. There's all this work in, employee engagement, and then there's DEIA, and then there's psychological safety, and then there's, but what are we really talking about? I think we're talking about building inspiring workplaces that drive results each and every time. And really, if you take location or flexibility or the tactic out of it, the bottom line is we're creating engaged workplaces. And that's where the data and research and science really lie in terms of employee engagement being the biggest indicator to business results and outcomes. Like more safe workplaces, less risk, less hazards, less accidents, greater productivity and innovation, greater risk taking. So I think where we can start is thinking about how we can teach ourselves to ask better questions first and foremost. And to your point, I've been a really big advocate of this over the last couple of years. But if you think about it, if you go up to a young child, let's say age 4 or 5, they ask you every last question on the side. Why is the sky blue? Why is the tree green? Why is that chair over there and not there? Why are you my mom? Whatever it might be. They ask every questions without limits. And when they go to school, they get taught to sit in a chair and raise their hand, and the teacher asks the questions and they answer. And all of our systems are sort of designed like that, if you think about it. Like if you're in a courtroom, the lawyer or the judge is asking you the question and you answer. You're in the workplace, the boss is asking you the question and you answer. And we've all been in those big meetings and those town halls where they're like, okay, we're going to brief you on our strategic priorities, and this is the direction we're going to go. And we're all in this together. Are there any questions? And so I think in terms of like at the micro level, teaching people how to have cultures of curiosity and normalizing the kind of questions we ask and creating cultures of curiosity through effective questioning first. And it's not questioning designed to like hear everybody whine or voice their concerns, but like, how can we get to better solutions? What would happen if we succeeded? What would happen if we failed? And I just am a really big fan of starting there, even when you're thinking about fundamentals in psychological safety and all of those other buzzwords that we're talking about, empathy, leading through engagement. I hope that helps answer a little bit about where I stand on that. But I couldn't agree more with you in terms of like where we fell off that cliff of being able to ask the right, hard, important, juicy, amazing questions, because that's how we get to the best solutions, We
talked about this too. And Dominic, I'm sure you have a question, so I'll just make this quick. But, we also talked about like, and why are we offended by everything? Like, we seem to get offended, like if someone does ask us a question, right? It's like, no, I actually care enough to ask you the question because I am trying to understand. I may never understand. I may never agree with you, but I'm trying to get there, And so it's like, let me at least ask the question so that we can have that conversation.
I can actually add on to that, with even more questions. It's kind of the space I find, if possible, like one can become unoffendable, or like the organization can become unoffendable. Because a lot of times, the question is asked and we haven't even gotten to the answer. It's the fact that particular question was asked that people disapprove of, or they feel somehow exposed. And of course, there can be something to be said of like tone and how the question is delivered. But Mika, do you have any thoughts on like how to create that optimal environment where the questions can just be asked? Is that an open forum? Is that some type of survey, that collection box where people collect it and then people like look at it later on? But where the organization benefits from receiving those questions, but also that energy of just neutrality and objectivity can be cultivated so people can at least hear and appreciate the question and benefit from the power of that insightful question being asked.
Yeah, I think it takes a multi-pronged approach, and it's sort of like a test, assess, and evolve kind of approach as well, because different cultures respond to different things, right? So for instance, at the Department of Homeland Security, it might look a little different than in one of those 3-letter IA agencies than in an executive department that has no, security clearance requirement or SCIF that we're dealing with, because different cultures respond and behave differently. But I think you can start by trying. However, I would suggest that it starts with effective social connections and bonding even first. And so I've been a huge fan of bringing in humor and laughter and fun, because there's actual behavioral science behind that on teams in terms of how they work and operate and lean in and also exhibit that discretionary effort, but openness to taking risks. So I'm a huge fan of learning tactics in a safe environment, but to breed more fun, laughter, and humor first, because those social bonds will make it more likely that you're going to be open and receptive when people ask questions. And then in terms of moving to more tactical resources and ideas for instilling a culture of curiosity, like you asked, you could try things like a question sprint, where you have a big, hairy problem or a strategic initiative or something new that you're launching, but you're only inviting people to ask questions. You're not going to answer it right away. And so you're inviting all the questions, doesn't matter how. People can ask them live on a video call like this. They could put it in the chat. Maybe you offer them an anonymous way. They can text in their answer if they feel more comfortable that way. Maybe there's a suggestion box. They can engage that way. And then you start opening the doors for more candid questions first. And then there could be other things as well. You could have a question, you could host a question sprint or do word polls, or especially in these kind of remote and hybrid environments where not everyone's going to be co-located in the same physical location all the time, every day. There's different ways to engage. And then again, like that test, assess, and evolve, and teaching managers how to ask questions differently, how to ask better questions, different questions. So people are thinking about things a little differently and are open to offering those solutions and answers. Because again, back to that town hall example I gave you, it's like we invite it, but we're not asking it the right way. Any questions? No, well, that tells me that you agree with everything I say and that everyone's on the same page. And that's likely not the case. Instead, you might ask, so how do you see this applying to your work? Or you can say, what are the risks if we succeed in this way? Or what could happen if we don't? And so there's different ways of asking those questions, but it's a skill and it sort of takes practice to make better, not necessarily perfect, but better.
When you talked about humor, it just kind of reminded me as well. Like, I'm a big proponent of that. I've read a lot of studies about how important it is, not just to be engaged, but in order to be engaged, you have to actually believe that you have a friend at work, that there's somebody at work that you like. And I remember I thought to myself one time, all right, that's kind of cool. Let me ask the Chico office, does everybody feel like they have a friend at work? And I remember this one individual, I could actually see who responded. So I remember this one individual, she responded, no, she didn't feel like she had a friend at work. It kind of broke my heart, right? Because like she was a good employee, but yet, and I thought her colleague who was beside her, I would have thought that was her friend, but she answered that she had no friends at work. And so, it's fascinating to me, like, this idea. I really wonder how over time, and we had this conversation with Chip actually, but how over time do we get to the point where we don't think that we can be friends with people at work, or we don't even think that we can like our boss, right? Like somehow we have to rail against our boss for that to seem like it's a good thing versus saying, oh, I actually kind of like my boss, or I want to have a huddle where we all kind of talk and laugh and joke and laugh at each other, right? Not just with each other, but at each other, so that when the tough issues come along, we're actually prepared for those because we like each other.
When I left government, I went and worked in a fully remote company. I never met my team as the vice president of an entire team, first ever in the company. And I never met them in person. And there is a skill to connection, even in a virtual or a remote environment. And it can be done. Some people will say, no, it's not the same. I beg to differ. I think there's a skill in terms of how you connect, but it also, again, takes practice. And that can come into play with how teams bond and connect over social similarities. So there are ways that you can start establishing rapport and fun on your teams. In fact, in addition to that question, do you have a best friend at work, or do you have a friend at work? You might even ask, when's the last time you saw like big smiles on your team's face? Is it our meetings are all about business only? When's the last time you belly laughed or had joy in your work? that matters. It matters so much. And like to your point, Angie, it matters across teams because that's what helps build that instrumental assistance, meaning when you need something or you're sick and you can't attend something, I'm going to lean in and help you out. And you're going to do the same for me because we kind of like each other.
Lynette, when she was talking, it reminded me kind of like about how we talk about energy, right? And how you read the energy in the room and like how that flows and like that, that aura that we all kind of have around us and how we're all bumping off of each other. And I didn't know if you wanted to expound on that a little bit.
Yeah, I teach in some of the workshops I do that, the energies of communication. And like you said, the laughter, that has an energetic vibration to it. When I like someone, it has an energetic vibration. When there's that friction, there might not be any words spoken, but man, you can really feel it in the room. I know you do workshops and things like that as well, Mika. Like, how do you work with people on energy? Is such a hard thing to understand. Like, how do you bring that in a way that most people can understand what it is you're conveying when you talk about laughter and smiling?
I love your work in this space, as you know, and we've even partnered on some of this kind of work before. And I am a huge fan of finding opportunities to weave in these kinds of skills and competencies into what other people might consider traditional professional development opportunities. So for instance, how can you map that understanding of energy and how you show up to how you are able to demonstrate active listening and deliver effective performance feedback and show up as part of a team? And so I'm really a fan, anyone listening today is in charge of thinking about how you can invest in skills development for your teams, considering how you can expand the focus in a more holistic approach from, your traditional sort of hard skills to what some people might call them soft. I call them success skills in this kind of a space. And especially after the pandemic, there's not one of us that wouldn't benefit from learning more about how energy plays into how we show up, either in leadership or as part of a team or in your life on a daily basis. So thank you for asking that question. And I've seen great benefit from it. I mean, we have teams all around the US federal government that right now are focused on resilience. And I'm a firm believer that this particular topic and skill should be a component of how we invest in those skills and competencies to lead and create resilient teams.
Yeah, I recall before I left the government, we had one individual in one of the organizations. He had started a really big focus on mindfulness. And it had become something that just grew and grew. It quite organic. He offered it. And I think it grew to like a weekly call. And people who just wanted to call in would participate. And from there, it even evolved it became, I might be wrong on this, but I think it became like a part of the new employee orientation. I think it became a regular piece in that.
I'm aware of the Mindful Fed community of practice, which is just this. It was started and born in the U.S. Forest Service. It was brought to NOAA as part of the Department of Commerce. And now there's this full community that gets together across the federal government. It's voluntary. I think it's maybe meets weekly as well, completely free. But it also aligns to the president's management agenda and management learning agenda on the well-being front. So it really aligns well. And let's face it, some of these topics the U.S. military has invested in for a long time, even in areas like healthy sleep, resilience and energy work, mindfulness as a leadership competency. If the military is investing in this for our frontline workers who sign up to defend this nation in the toughest of circumstances, then there must be something to it.
No, I agree, because I know, Lynette, you've actually used the example with heart math, where even the Navy SEALs uses it, right? This idea of getting your heart and your mind into coherence. I know at DHS, this is one thing I was always thrilled with, is that the leadership was always so supportive of the things that I was, trying to do and trying to bring to the workforce. But I think that one of the things is they absolutely cared about the people. Don't get me wrong. but they also knew that this was about mission readiness, right? This was about making sure that the mission got done as well, because they saw the evidence of what happens when you have a workforce that's not mission ready. Because it's scared, or because it's frustrated, or because it's angry, or whatever things are going on in their lives. And so they really figured out quickly that the more that they could help them from a holistic or whole person perspective, the better off that they could perform the mission once they got to DHS.
And we're seeing that on the employee engagement scores globally as well across the federal government. So even things like the uncertainty around back to office for those knowledge workers who for a long while were able to remote work or participate in telework on a more increased scale than they were before. The uncertainty of not knowing what their work arrangement will be like, and the lack of transparency in terms of what direction agencies might be taking, have a significant impact, more so than the decision, on people's engagement and satisfaction levels overall.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, I had this conversation with someone the other day about fear-based leadership, and I don't think we intend to do it, right? I don't think of course, there's some leaders out there that thrive on that, but that's rare. But for the most part, I think it's unintentional. But I think it kind of goes back to your point about how you ask the question, right? Like when you just say, are there any questions? And you start going like this because, Lord, I hope there's no questions because I need to get to my next meeting. It's going to drive a no questions, right? Versus the way that you presented it. And I think that is really important, that we sit down and we really think through, like, how are we engaging with our workforce and what is really coming through when we have these kinds of conversations? Because and Dominic, maybe you mentioned it, but it is the tone, right? It is the inflection. It is the way that we carry ourselves whenever we have some of these conversations with folks that I think can inadvertently drive a culture of fear that is never really intended. Because the manager will say, well, I'm just trying to get accountability. But the employee, if every morning they have to wake up thinking, oh my God, I got to report out to my boss today whether or not I made 5 recruits or 6 recruits or whatever I did, you're already going to be anxious. You're already going to be scared before you even begin your day. And so I just don't think that that's healthy. And we have to figure out ways to help our leadership and our managers really figure out, like, again, not just having a conversation, but how to have the conversation in a way that it engenders like trust and openness and willingness to listen to what they have to say.
I agree with that so much. And it is a new skill too, to ask the questions differently or hold space for the pause, the strategic pause.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And invite people to respond. How often have we heard someone say, I think we can all agree that this is a great place to work. Well, what happens if you don't then? Now you just close me out. I can't give you my feedback. I'm not allowed to, because we all agree, right?
I read this thing one time about when you said about the pause, and I loved it, and I'll probably butcher it, but it was really about breathing. It said, like, when you take a breath, right, there is a pause at the top. And then you breathe out and there is a pause at the bottom. Like we don't realize it, but you are pausing. And so it said in that pause is when you should really like have the most openness and be inviting and everything else. It's in the pause. It's not in the breathing. And I think what they were really trying to say is we're so busy breathing, right? that we don't even recognize that there's a pause there and that a lot of goodness is happening in that pause.
That is powerful. Yeah. I mean, when do we think about our breath, especially at work? And it's our life force, And in a meeting, you can suck the life out of a meeting by not needing that pause. It's funny because even in some of the hybrid and remote work sort of best practices that I help teams and leaders think about, I often introduce the hippopotamus concept. And it's super easy. It can be your mascot in remote and hybrid meetings, but it's like, could you pause for 5 hippopotamuses? And so you don't respond when you're introducing something new or inviting feedback. You wait 1 hippopotamus, 2 hippopotamus, 3 hippopotamus, 4 hippopotamus. It's long. It feels long and it's only 5 seconds. 5. It's a different kind of skill. And so now I have people in different organizations saying, okay, we're going to do the hippopotamus. So I'm but it is a skill, right? Just like breath work and energy work and all of these things. And we can bring these best practices into how we want to create cultures of innovation and safety and empowerment and engagement for all the benefit of our folks who do the hard work each and every day, no matter where they work from.
Yeah, this has been a really powerful conversation, and I've really enjoyed it, Mika. And I was just wondering if my co-host Lynette and Dominic, do you have any other questions?
I don't have any other questions, but I just want to say thank you for, coming on and being so vulnerable and honest and, just sharing all these insights. You've had this expansive career across so many different ways of looking at life. So it's just so great to have someone with such different perspectives of how different people function in different parts of life and bring that in. So yeah, I loved the conversation. We could talk for another couple hours. Yeah.
Two things occurred to me. One, because there's been so much talk about questions here, instead of saying like, are there any questions? Maybe open the space of like, so we've talked about where we're going or what we intend to do. Like what would be some good questions at this point in time? And just inviting that, not even with the intention of answering those, and says, okay, so now we have some like questions that we need to think about. And so maybe between now and the next meeting, like, there'll be some effort to work on these, or there'll be some effort to get back to these, or we can take these questions and we can prioritize, or we can put them out there and you guys can prioritize them for us. And then we'll try to answer them, or you can try to submit some other things. And the other thing, which is a question, we always hear about, I think typically like tech companies doing like, the bleeding edge of like the workplace, the remote work. And, they've done things like, taking care of all the food needs, taking care of all like dry cleaning needs, taking care of transportation needs. I think a lot of companies even gone as far as, taking care of fertility needs, like freezing, like, eggs for women.
I wasn't sure where you were going with that.
Oh.
And even menopause benefits in private industry they're introducing now, which is interesting conversation.
So speaking of those interesting conversations and knowing that you look at the future of work, what are some of the things, maybe like the one or two things that you find like the most interesting on the horizon, the most interesting that people are dealing with right now in terms of where work is going? Because we always hear the conversation of like remote work. But like what else in addition to that?
All right. So this might be a little shocking, but I'm a huge fan of taking pause and just taking inventory of all the things we're doing right and celebrating them also. And so employers, and especially the federal government, have an awful lot of amazing resources, benefits, and flexible work policies already. And I really think it's important for us to reset and rethink about how we communicate what is already available. What are we already investing in? And how can we leverage and empower leaders to be able to make the right decisions for our people? Because what works well for Lynette isn't what always is going to work well for Angie, isn't going to be what works well for you based on the character and nature of your job, the requirements of your duties, or your life. And so starting there, I think, is really important. There are benefits that are underutilized through the Employee Assistance Program, through your health insurance that offers sometimes even nutritional coaching, fitness coaching, mindfulness, and even sometimes financially incentivizes you to take certain incentives to do that. There are flexible spending accounts, healthcare savings accounts, and a wide variety of flexible workplace options that fit even those frontline and deskless workers. Those are people that never will be able to participate in remote or telework, but that they have lives and need flexibility too. So I think first, just making sure that we are really leveraging and harnessing the power of the benefits and policies and initiatives that we already have at our fingertips, and making sure that people are aware of them and that they are using them to their advantage. And then secondly, just really considering that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to the future. And what works yesterday isn't going to work tomorrow. So when you get someone that professes to be a future work expert or a futurist, I hope that means somebody who has an open mindset, a continuously learning mindset, who is learning from the past, the current work experience, and applying that to ways that we could think about doing things a little differently. And the future doesn't always have to be so arduous in terms of like these big, large scale changes. We can try things on a micro level. And what's the worst thing that's going to happen as long as they're legal and ethical? And how can we say yes and invite employees to the conversation? Because employees, they want to do a good job. Our workforce is highly dedicated. We all know that. They care deeply about the mission and the quality of their work. They might have solutions. You can ask them, how will you be able to participate in these kinds of flexibilities while still being responsive to this, this, and this? Maybe they have an answer that you hadn't even thought of yet. So I think as much as we can think about like leveraging what we have and what we do well and thinking about creative approaches and solutions to the future by keeping an open and continuous learning mindset, I think those are the elements that will set us up for success no matter what the future throws at us.
Thank you, Mika. I've also enjoyed, hearing from you today and hearing about your work experience and your ideas. Thank you.
Yeah, it's like every time we have a conversation, even with people that we think we know well, it's like, oh, we always learn something, right? And it's always just fascinating, especially like hearing your Army career. I mean, it's not, an area that I think we've touched on before. So thank you for sharing that. And thank you for serving. So Mika, it's been such a pleasure getting your thoughts on transformational, innovative, and global workspaces and so much more. I look forward to diving deeper into the stories behind the stories each month. For more information and to learn more about us, please go to www.anandalife.org. Have a great day.